So the focus of my presentation is titled Children's Rights and the African Union's Response to COVID-19, with a specific focus on children's rights. And this presentation emanates from, I'm not sure, Dr. Soyapi, whether you can hear me. Perfect. So this presentation emanates from manuscripts that I am developing with a colleague from the University of Benin in Nigeria. And we focused on this research for two reasons. The first one is that Africa is the first continent to have a child rights specific instrument that specifically focuses on children's rights. And then secondly, this conversation is as an environmental dimension, specifically how it affects children's rights. And also the fact that we consider the regional perspective and understand that this conference is specifically looking at South Africa, but there is also a dimension which is regional and continental. So that's the other aspect that we then considered the relevance of this paper and within the context of the conference. I'll just give an outline. Our presentation will proceed as follows. That it will give an introduction and setting the scene on why is it important for us to talk about children's rights within the context of the African Union as a regional body. And then we discuss the African Union's responses to COVID-19 broadly, and then proceed to talk about the impacts of COVID-19 on children specifically and children's rights. I will then proceed to talk about children and the African Union legal and policy framework and see whether it has been tailored or it caters for the rights and interests of children because they are a specifically vulnerable group. The manuscript is developed in such a way that it contextualizes and touch aspects that are happening in sub-regions across Africa. But for purposes of this presentation, I'm just going to stick to East and Southern Africa in the interest of time, and then just point out to our findings in that regard. So as a way of introduction, children are a vulnerable group, and that is explicitly mentioned in the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, and also in other instruments, particularly the Agenda 2040, which is specifically focusing on children's rights. And the fact that children are interdependent and they are still developing, they require attention and they require protection. And within the context of environmental law, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Environment issued a resolution that specifically focuses on the environmental impacts of children and how children are impacted. And then the second issue is that it is vital to discuss on children's rights within the context of Africa because statistics have revealed that more than 50% of Africa's population is estimated to be children. So it is important to give a proper consideration to how the rights of children will be affected. Then also within the context of COVID-19, the UNICEF Executive Director, Henriette Fore, has proclaimed that without urgent action, which may be global or regional or national, COVID-19 health crisis risks becoming a child rights crisis. And it takes into account the factors that I have just mentioned. So the African Union's response to COVID-19 have broadly been on a rights-based perspective without specifically looking at children's rights. But I'm going to elaborate further how, to some instances, there was a bias towards women's rights and less of children's rights within the context of the African Union's response. So the African Union's chairperson, His Excellency President Ramaphosa, appointed 4 envoys sometime in April to deal with funding of COVID-19 responses and poverty alleviation. But I mentioned 3 important aspects which were part of the mandate. The first one is the issue of economic, to ensure that countries in Africa do not fall into economic shortfalls and meltdown. And then the second aspect is to do with health, to ensure that healthy systems within African states are salvaged and there is an attempt to ensure that they don't get to a situation where people can't be helped. And there was a Africa joint continental strategy for COVID-19 outbreak, which was issued and specifically targeting issues to do with trade and issues to do with the finances of states and how they can be assisted through international development. And then lastly, there is the Africa's governance response to COVID-19. And this preliminary report was made within the context or developed by African peer review mechanism. And how this was developed, it was developed specifically looking into sub-regions, East Africa, SADC, Southern Africa, West Africa, Central Africa, and the developments happening under ECOWAS and so forth. And it is interesting to note, and I'm going to specifically mention this, that there is no explicit mention of children's rights or the best interests of the child. And I'm going to develop this argument further as I go down and explain the need to focus on children's rights in African Union's response to COVID-19. So when one looks at the responses at African Union, there are two views that one can get. The first view is that children's rights are catered broadly, because once you address healthy at a broader perspective, you also address the health of children. Once you address the economy, indirectly, once you have addressed what is happening within the family or within parents or adults, how they are working, then it means you've also addressed aspects to do with the rights and welfare of children. But on the other hand, you will notice that a failure to explicitly mention issues to do with children's rights and their best interests and how they require to be specifically and explicitly mentioned can also cause a disadvantage on the rights of children. So how has COVID-19 impacted on children? Firstly, there are direct and indirect consequences, but I'm just going to outline a few of the consequences that COVID-19 has impacted on children. The first one is access to education. There are ongoing debates on when and how should schools open amidst COVID-19, but there is evidence that proves that there's been a widening gap of inequality. So COVID-19 has widened the inequality gap because of online learning and children from poor backgrounds and children from well-to-do backgrounds. And also when you talk of how initiatives were being taken to ensure that children can learn through radio, and then you also they tend to think of those without access to radio, those without access to electricity, how are they going to have access to the lessons that are conducted on radio and on what time, and how are they going to access such learning material? So there's been a widening of inequality there. And then there are also aspects to do with access to the environment and nature. And I'm going to specifically mention that the African Children's Charter, in particularly Article 11, mention issues to do with the environment, specifically that children should be developed to respect the environment and also natural resources. So as a result of COVID-19, there's a deprivation due to lockdown restrictions where children are limited in terms of their interaction with the environment and then impacting how they interact with the environment and then the right to play. There are also financial and economic crash that has happened and affecting households, unemployment, and then plunging children into poverty. And then there is exposure of children to sexual abuse, to domestic violence, gender-based violence. There's a study that was conducted by the African Child Policy Forum in Ethiopia, which indicates that in countries such as South Sudan, and Ethiopia, there has been an increase in children that are subjected to female genital mutilation and sexual abuse. And these studies have indicated that this is as a result of the fact that children are at home, they're not exposed to their teachers where they can then report cases. And this impacts negatively on the life of children and then issues to do with the right to life, health, and education. And then within the African Children's Charter, or rather the AU legal and policy framework, broadly, there is the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, but I'm going to consider the 4 principles that anchor the implementation of children's rights within the region. The principle of survival and development, non-discrimination, and the best interests of the child, and also participation. But when one looks at survival and development, one can make an argument that the fact that the African Union's response and the envoys were focusing on healthy systems and the economy and financial systems, it helps to promote that right to development and survival. But there's one issue that stands out, the fact that there's no child participation that can be stressed within, that can be traced within the developments that were within the African Union's response. But thanks to the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, they issued a guiding note on COVID-19 and how the rights of children should be implemented within the context of COVID-19. I'll just give a summary of the issues that were pointed out, issues to do with access to information on COVID-19, and issues to do with child-friendly quarantine procedures, access to education, and then provision of essential service to do with survival and development within the context of COVID-19. Within East and Southern African perspectives, we noticed that there were child rights regional networks that were focusing on child participation through webinars and engaging children. But we noticed also that within the context of responses in many countries, such as Kenya and Zimbabwe, women, there is what we termed then the Women and Children Response Clause, where children were included in women's responses on response to do with women and girls, but no explicit mention of children as a standalone group that needs specific attention. Then we also noticed that in countries such as South Africa, in the case of De Beers versus Minister of Cooperative Governance Traditional Affairs, the High Court made an explicit proclamation of how lockdown regulations affected the best interest of the child in section 22, subsection 2 of the Constitution, which links to how then courts can then sometimes help governments to keep governments to account to ensure that issues to do with children's rights are explicitly mentioned. And in recommendations, this is our recommendations. We recommend that responses to COVID-19 or the plans to strategies that are needed to inform the COVID-19 responses should be rights-based and also taking into account the best interests of the child in line with African Children's Charter. And also we recommend that there is need for integrating the needs of specifically vulnerable groups such as children with disabilities and internally displaced persons in these strategies and plans. Also, importantly, we recommend that the principle and the right to child participation should form an integral part in response designs, even within the context of environmental impact of COVID-19 and so forth. And we recommend that states must implement the African Committee's guiding note to integrate in national and domestic responses. Thank you so much.